Hello, World Wide Web friends. Steve Persch here of Pantheon. Today, I want us web professionals to get our story straight. I'm guessing you've had an experience like this one I've had many times. A family member, a friend, someone outside the world of professional web development asks you earnestly, how hard can it be? It's just a website. We hear in the broader discourse about debacles like healthcare.gov or recently the FAFSA overhaul. And it's hard to explain to those outside of the world of web development why it is that some things on the internet feel so easy and simple, and other things are hard and expensive and complicated. Joining me now to talk about two areas where web work can feel particularly overwrought, higher education and government, are Malik of Pantheon and Seth Hill of ATEN Design. Malik and Seth, welcome. How's it going?
Great. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Going well. Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
All right. So I was recently discussing with another Pantheon this news story of perhaps a catastrophic decline in college enrollment thanks to a botched rollout of the FAFSA overhaul. Did either of you hear about this?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
It's been in all places.
This may not be at the level of the healthcare.gov rollout, but a few things are jumping out to me in the news stories that I've seen about this. People who the number of students who have successfully submitted the FAFSA is down 29%. That feels really bad. The government official overseeing this is resigning, presumably in part thanks to this botched rollout, Richard Cordray, and individual institutions are at risk financially if they do not get the same pace or the same level of government assistance that they've gotten in the past. And for those who have had to submit the FAFSA, I remember going through that as I was entering college. It used to be hundreds of questions. I think the idea here was to simplify it, and somehow it ended up more complicated. How does this happen? I know you guys may not have direct visibility into the details of this FAFSA overhaul, but from your experience working in both the complicated fields of government and higher education, why are these projects so hard to get right?
Sure. I mean, I think these kind of large projects are complicated, like really no matter what sector they're in, whether it's education or government or the commercial sector. I think when you have a large number of stakeholders with different experiences, the number of systems that you have to integrate, well, all of those things like really add together and, sort of like exponentially make the project harder with each one of those that you add in.
Yeah, one detail that stood out to me reading this FAFSA story was the expectation or the idea that we can simplify things for those filling out the form if we automatically bring in data from the IRS, so that it's not a burden on individuals filling out the form to manually bring over their financial data from tax returns into the form. That sounds like a noble goal. But that worries me as a technologist, thinking, okay, we're presumably shifting back-end implementation details of how the FAFSA itself works, and at the same time, we're going to add in a new integration. I would prefer to do those two things separately. Malik, I'm curious, in your experience, have you had multiple requirements stacked up that feel overly burdensome? When I know you've worked in multiple government projects, is it normal for these larger scale projects to have those multiple requirements stacked up that are expected to all work in one rollout or one launch?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that was really common for me to see, and you see it actually with the FAFSA launch as well, right? I think it said like they were modernizing over 20 systems or overhauling over 20 systems, and some of them hadn't been updated in nearly 50 years. So what can happen is this concept of like gold plating in software development, where you figure out like, okay, I've identified what is the minimum viable product, our MVP that we want to build is. And oftentimes with these kinds of large builds, it's just modernizing the platform as like an initial goal. But then, frankly, like developers, as well as the stakeholders themselves can get starry-eyed and say, oh, well, we have an opportunity to improve this process here at the same time. And so then what can happen is you get these layers of, now we're introducing new like logic to our business rules, while we're also modernizing our system. Our legacy system was not well documented anywhere. And so you have developers who are trying to read code written in a language they might not understand or have never worked with, to parse out business rules that their stakeholders don't know because the business rules predate them. And at the same time, they're trying to modernize, and it's a recipe for a delayed timeline.
Yeah, that seems worrisome, and absolutely something that can happen in government institutions where there. It would not surprise me if to hear that there are portions of IRS technology that are, as you mentioned, 50 years old, although that may not have been the IRS specifically. Seth, I know you also have worked a lot in higher education. It stands out to me that we have universities in this country that are older than the United States government. We have massive sprawling universities with decades or centuries of systems and processes. What are some of the differences that you have seen working in large scale higher educational institutions compared to working for newer companies in the private sector that don't have decades and decades of processes and systems to keep going or overhaul?
Yeah, I think the age of those systems is really kind of the key to that. These processes have been developed, refined, and adjusted over years and years and years. I mean, they didn't just happen overnight. And so the idea of trying to refactor them overnight is maybe unrealistic. I think there's sort of a case where you end up like somehow touching a mainframe in the development process. There's something that has been running, and it has been running reliably for years, decades, like you say. So there hasn't been really a good business case to overhaul that in the past. And so you take that technical debt forward with you a bit, and then compound that over, 20 years or something. And it's now a much bigger project than it seems at the outset.
Yeah, and one thing that strikes me about the difference between projects in higher education and in the government compared to faster moving privately held companies, I think of the old Facebook motto, move fast and break things. Like, that had any number of problems for Facebook as they carried that mindset forward, but that mindset made a certain kind of sense at a certain kind of scale, but that mindset does not fit in government or higher education. I recently watched the prestige TV shows around WeWork and Uber, and it stood out to me just how much of the business model of newer technology startups is a comfort with breaking the law. That Uber was comfortable breaking laws around how taxis operate. That's an option. That's not an option on a government project or a higher education project. Are there other things that feel different? Like, okay, I hope responsible technologists do not want to break the law in their work. But is there a difference in day-to-day feeling working on a project where there's any number of regulations to be followed, and projects where that is just not top of mind?
Yeah, there's a couple of angles where I saw, maybe I'll call it red tape. Like there are heavier processes that I saw working on the government side. I'll give you an example. Like it's much more common to run into like a fully locked down development environment when working in the government space, where you have to tunnel into some system. And in like the open source PHP world, right, we use things like Composer to download new packages, and you're tapped into this whole open source world. Or you might be using npm to pull in packages. And in the government space, I remember having to, for example, ask for explicit approval to download a package before I could download it. And then once I was actually downloading it, I was actually downloading it within like a tunneled system that, was fully locked down, by some of these federal contractors and state contractors and EDU contractors that have now specialized in this kind of like tooling. So that's just like one little example, let alone like release processes. Like I have to ask for like very explicit approval with what I'm releasing, which is not uncommon, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but at some point it has to get like 3 or 4 layers of approval. And we're talking about like I'm changing the color of like buttons on like the bottom of a page. So like little things like that you kind of may run into that I don't see as much on the private sector side.
Are there any things that get easier or are potentially worried about less in these spaces? One thing that jumps out to me is a federal agency that I'll not name, because even though this was a decade ago, I'll just not call them out too directly. There's a federal agency over a decade ago that open sourced a Drupal theme, and I thought, oh, this is cool. A government-written Drupal theme. I looked at it, and I almost immediately found an XSS vulnerability, a cross-site scripting vulnerability, which in the Drupal 5, 6, 7 era was just like the most common security bug in practically every Drupal site had one of these. It's a little worrisome, but I think it's actually less worrisome when you know that the only way this could be exploited would be for someone who has gotten through all of the government hoops to take it upon themselves to do some damage to the website. And if there is a government employee who's decided, I want to do some damage to this website, there are much more direct ways they could go about it than putting script tags inside of a Drupal field. So I oddly thought, you know what, in this case, that security hole is less worrisome because the people operating the system are far more trustworthy than in practically any other Drupal site where the people who have permission to publish content didn't have to go through multiple extensive background checks before they could even get to the point where they can log into Drupal. Are there other things that get unexpectedly easier in these kinds of projects?
Yeah, I think, sometimes those compliance standards can be, sort of like a saving grace in projects, in that they are well-defined. The requirements are, very binary, and either you meet them or you don't. And so that, I think, sometimes makes it a little easier because you kind of know what you have to do to be compliant. You're probably not going to be taking as many, I don't want to say risks, but using maybe some of like the newest technologies that aren't as proven, like using things that are more familiar, a little more hardened and compliant. Yeah.
Yeah. And Seth, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think I'm imagining what might be a tough conversation in another scenario of, oh, let's add this sparkly new bit of functionality to the website as a request you might get, and the web developer may think, no, this is bad for multiple reasons, one of which is it's going to pose accessibility problems. I think what I'm hearing you say is it gives you a more definitive way to say no. No, we can't do this. No, I'm not going to do this dubious request because we have to follow these relatively clear accessibility rules.
Yeah, and I think, Malik alluded to this too, is that, maybe I want to use this package, but it hasn't been vetted, or no one's really using it. Like someone who looks at that might say, there's no way you can put that in your project. Like, or we have to go through a pretty, systematic audit to make sure that this is not a security problem, that, it can be maintained for some time period, the lifespan of this application. And, like you say, accessibility is a huge thing.
Yeah, and another one is security and data privacy. Reading some of these stories around the FAFSA, I see mentions to social security numbers. And I think to myself, boy, I am grateful that for most of my web development career, I did not have to touch social security numbers. It feels a bit like, I don't know, it's not exactly like handling radioactive material, but it's sensitive information that requires different levels of procedures and security. Like what is, in your experience in government projects, Malik, what do you need to do to appropriately handle far more sensitive information than you would encounter if the Drupal or WordPress website you're building is fundamentally brochureware advertisement that has no sensitive data in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, it's funny, like for the most of my like government sites and EDU sites are often using Drupal for, effectively like their brochure sites, like the face of their organization. And so with a lot of those, I'd say we're also fortunate to not have to be storing some of that sensitive information, but we did work on some internal systems. And there's this concept of like keeping your data secure at rest and in transit. And so you're always having to make sure that if I'm storing like form submissions, for example, and it's coming in with like PII, or if I'm, very intentionally like storing like a database of social security numbers or any combination of information together that can form PII, it has to be secured at rest. So it has to be secured in your database, and transit would be like over an email or something like that. And so there are mechanisms that you can use to make sure that your data is encrypted, for example. When you're storing it at rest, when you're storing it in your database, the government would actually often have systems that they would want us to leverage in order to ensure that we were sending data, for example, securely. So like an SMTP relay that they trust. And so we would have to set up like a tunnel from our hosting provider to this SMTP relay to make sure email is being sent properly in transit. And so if you are working with a government agency that doesn't necessarily, or that's fully relying on you and doesn't have like a mature security practice, then, you could get in trouble there if you yourself, don't know how to approach those sorts of problems. But I would say like security is something the government was particularly good at least in my experience. They were always very aware and didn't want to get caught in a breach.
Yeah, absolutely. I recall even before I could have permission to work on a project for the federal government that I ended up contributing, I think, less than 10 billable hours to. I had to get fingerprinted, extensive background check, even just to walk in the door. And that's something that so many other projects don't have, that high bar of time and cost just to bootstrap someone into being able to contribute to the project at all. Seth, I'm curious about in higher education, you may not need to go through an FBI background check to work in higher education. I found, at least in my experience, I did need to take a drug test before I could work on a particular .edu project. Are there other areas that make, or other specifics that make ramping up a new team member onto a .edu project more cumbersome than it would be if they were ramping up onto a different sort of project?
Yeah, and I think that this is, it goes to something about what kind of level of privacy the data needs. If it's something like a brochureware site, then, probably anyone can work on that. We might be dealing with some information about students, maybe like a lived name versus a given name. And, some of that might not seem like it's very sensitive, but in cases it is. And so we might not want everyone to have visibility into that data, going all the way up into like financial data and social security numbers, things like that. It's like, so you're compartmentalizing data and only giving access to the people who really need it and controlling access that way. But I have seen cases where people have done things, with no malicious intent, that end up exposing that kind of data. For example, people love web forms, and it might seem like we want to make this easier for people to send us information, and so we're just going to create a web form that asks for your, student name and your student ID number and your address on campus or something like that. And there are rules about how long we can retain that data. What happens if someone requests that we remove it? And those things add to the complexity of it, and they affect that web form that maybe didn't seem like it was really consequential at all.
Sure, and I imagine for a university that integrates in so many aspects of the life of an individual student, it covers housing and meals, healthcare, that a technology solution that may be built for something as innocuous as, do you want to buy season football tickets, may not be appropriate when the situation is, do you want to request this specific health service?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Malik, one thing I'm curious about in the work you did in government projects is ensuring the scalability and performance of a particular site. One thing I'm thinking through is, you mentioned the requirement to often tunnel in or SSH into lockdown infrastructure. I think, if that infrastructure is locked down in ways that were grounded in decades-old practices, that infrastructure might be harder to horizontally scale for a traffic spike. How do you approach scalability and performance questions, or how is it different approaching those in a government or a higher education project?
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting is, like, with both .gov and .edu sites, is like, by having those domains, you already get the benefit of like better SEO. So you have like the steady traffic. You get this steady traffic that's always coming to your site. So you do need to be prepared. Like, it's a very real thing that you do need to be prepared with. With these brochure sites, it's often more straightforward, but using something like the equivalent of like a Pantheon, global CDN or an advanced global CDN offering, standing that up in front of your site. And for those who are not aware, like, the CDN stands for content delivery network. And so you set these up as like these kind of like reverse proxies in front of your website, where they're able to, if a person has visited your homepage once, that goes all the way back to your your hosting provider, right? So like your Pantheon, your Drupal or your WordPress application calculates what response it needs to give back to serve up that end user their homepage. When it routes back, your CDN, your content delivery network, like your global or your AGCDN, for example, can now hang on to that response. So that the next time somebody comes and visits your homepage, they don't have to go back to your hosting provider to ask for it again, and now they can just serve it. And so this type of a setup, I remember being really critical, actually, working on whitehouse.gov. We worked on every year was the State of the Union. And so, like, the amount of traffic that would come to that page, while the stakeholders wanted like these really nice dynamic experiences, was challenging in some ways. But having that global CDN made sure that you can serve millions and millions of page views, and have these CDNs standing as like this line of defense in front of your core infrastructure that don't take your site down. So something like that was particularly important.
Yeah, you mentioning the State of the Union also makes me think another potential difference here with government and maybe to a lesser degree or a similar degree higher education websites, the distance between the most important things and the least important things seems to be much greater than in a private sector use case, where few things in the calendar year get as much attention as the State of the Union. It makes sense that for the stakeholders, that is extremely important, and they are going to put an immense amount of pressure on everyone involved for all things related to the State of the Union. And then there are presumably some other pages on a government website that not even the stakeholders care that much about. And that a comment, or I imagine there's, I don't know if whiplash is the right word, but I imagine it's a lot of moving between brain spaces to think about the most important thing, and then things that may not be important at all. Very, very different from, I imagine, a private sector website that has often a more steady flow of traffic, or occasional spikes dependent on email blasts. Doesn't have the attention of a large portion of the world tuning in as the leader of the free world speaks about the state of the union. Were there other things, Malik, that in your work in government where you found yourself thinking, oh wow, this is so much more important, so much more loaded or fraught than anything I've dealt with? I know, I mean, the transition between one executive and another comes to mind. When one president leaves and another president comes in, that to me seems like something that is going to have much more downstream effects than if, like, I don't know, the president of your privately held company leaves and a new president comes in. What was it like as one president leaves and another president comes in?
Yeah, that was probably the most fascinating point in my career, to be honest. So the majority of my clients were political appointees. So that was very interesting. So when one administration left, that meant almost all of my clients left with that administration. And so I had to meet this net new set of clients. And with that, the way that the previous administration had structured the contract with our company was such that like our contract went into, I can't remember exactly how long, but months into the new administration, essentially. So what was very interesting was having to wipe the slate clean as far as content from the prior administration to get it ready for the next administration to come in and enter their content. And there was like this whole set of drama that came with that, political drama, that like this administration just deleted these very important pages. And we're behind the scenes saying, well, no, we just deleted everything because none of it belonged. Nothing belonged to the new administration. Literally, the people that wrote the content are gone. There's new people here. It was like a clean slate, right? It was like if you were starting a new website with Pantheon, using our like upstreams offering, it's like you're stamping out a new site, like using that model, and you want a clean slate for that new site. Essentially, it just happened to share the same domain name.
Sure.
So that was really interesting to see. It was fascinating.
Yeah, we're talking to some degree as if government and higher ed are very, very similar culturally. I imagine one difference, though, Seth, that you saw in your higher education experience is that there are multiple executives. I was talking in Pantheon office hours with some folks who work in the EDU space, and they were talking about how any individual professor may act seemingly with the authority of a one-off university president and have very high expectations, especially if that professor has won a Nobel Prize or something. At least in the federal government, there's the clarity on like, okay, there is the one president and everyone is working downstream from them. But in a university, no, there are multiple people acting as if they are the most important person, and obviously their requests are the most important requests for the web. Has that been your experience?
I've certainly experienced some things like that. A lot of it too depends on what the audience of that site is. Like in my experience, we had some sites that were very, very popular, and a lot of traffic came from the public, from articles like in the New York Times or wherever they were quoted. And so that site was, maybe not important operationally, but received a ton of traffic and was very important to that professor and was very visible on the university side as well. And so that took some resources. We had sites that we were working on that were really operationally critical. They might not have been transactional sites, but the information that was on them was very important to students, faculty, emergency services, things like that. So keeping those running was a very, very high importance to us. Some of the other sites that weren't as important, it wasn't such a big deal if they went down, but people are very vocal. These sites are very visible, and it makes a difference if things go down.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also curious, Seth, about the way timelines play out in university culture or in government culture. I know I have fallen into the trap of thinking, oh, here's a request that's coming to me as the developer. The question, how long is this going to take, comes along for the ride. And I think to myself, oh yeah, how many minutes or hours will my hands be on the keyboard in order to execute this request? And that is the amount of time I pass along. That is not the amount of time I should be passing along, though. How do you think about the task of estimation and communicating timelines in a government or a higher education space where the institution is hundreds of years old and time is measured differently?
Yeah. I think it's funny because I kind of had this rule of thumb that, like, if I thought something was going to take me maybe a day to do, I would communicate that was going to be a week within my internal team. And then outwardly, we might communicate that that's going to take a month to complete. And, it's not so much that the development time takes any longer. It's that you have a lot of different stakeholders that might be in different parts of the world, have different schedules. It takes a long time to get people together. It takes a long time to get people to agree on requirements. It takes a long time to get that sort of consensus to get to the point that you can do the 2 hours of development work and everything. And I think that as a developer, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, oh, that's 2 hours. And now your stakeholder believes that they're going to have that in 2 hours from now. And you're like, well, no, you're probably going to get that in 2 weeks, Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to kind of remember the audience, remember who all is involved, all of the parts that are going to come together, to complete that project, including the planning, the documentation, the testing, all of the things that are even going to happen after that development, and communicate that full timeline.
Mm-hmm. Have you found that when it goes well, that web projects then last longer successfully? We sort of began this conversation around the federal college aid program and the fact that there are 50-year-old technologies that are getting overhauled, as if that is like unambiguously a bad thing. But from another perspective, maybe those developers 50 years ago were successful. Maybe they did their jobs well if what they built lasted for 50 years. Have you ever found yourself thinking, oh, I made this either entire website or this bit of functionality in the website, and because we did all of that due diligence and took an appropriate amount of time, it's going to now last for a longer amount of time than a web project would in the private sector?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember working with one customer. We were building out like this tool for them to be able to like stamp out websites really quickly. And their legacy system was ginormous. Like it was hundreds and hundreds of sites. And I remember making like a passing comment. I was in my younger days, and I made like a passing comment, like, well, it's really hard working with these like legacy systems that are just like built on, I don't know, it was like making some kind of comment like this. And one of the original developers is in the room, and he's like, I resemble that remark. Like we worked really hard. And I apologized to him because when we got to the end of the project, we were still discovering features that they had built into their legacy system that were so well built and so robust that like, they just weren't documented anywhere. But like the stakeholder would be like, I used to have the ability to specify that the date was all day, and I lost that ability, as part of the migration. I'm like, wow, I didn't think about that. So yeah, no, the duration sometimes of these programs, like in terms of like how long these legacy systems last, I think you're right. Like it oftentimes is a testament to, to how they were built. But on that note, as you were speaking, Seth, like I started to think about how, there's like the technological aspect and like all of these, legacy systems. But then there's also the fact that like the government itself is having this big transition from like waterfall to like agile processes, and what can become really challenging is when you get like a customer that has not identified their product owner, and you're trying to execute on these agile processes, and there's no decision maker over there who's comfortable with making digital decisions, because that's not what that agency was built to make. So that was also something that was like really challenging. It's like moving away from like, you deliver something in a sprint and it doesn't necessarily look pretty because it's not like the whole picture. And you have these clients on the government side who are saying, this is ugly. Like, this is not what I asked for. And you're like, just be patient. We're delivering iteratively. And they're not used to that. Some of them are not. But yeah, that was also like just like another aspect that kind of was a curveball to me.
Yeah. Making sure you as the web developers or the web development team have someone within the institution comfortable exercising the authority they definitively have, or at least picking up the authority that no one else is claiming. Like it's you can't put a price on that, because if there's not an internal decision maker willing to say, yes, this is what we asked for, or no, this is definitively off track, that the team may end up spinning in circles. We're starting to run low a bit on time, but before we go, Seth and Malik, I'm curious, would you have any advice for someone working on or about to undertake a government or a higher education web project?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is thinking about the audience, and we talked a little bit about the ideas of testing, making sure that you're testing for people who have different accessibility needs, making sure that you're asking people who might have different language requirements, who might have varying levels of technical experience, and getting some of these ideas in front of people early to start figuring out some of, where things are, where there's a gap between what is needed and what's being delivered. I think that would be one thing. And then just knowing that it is that hard and timelines are long in these cases.
Yeah, I agree. I'd say, probably my biggest piece of advice is to pad your estimates. We touched on that, but pad your estimates and do not be afraid to tell your customer that this is going to be a longer endeavor than we all think it will be. Like, being transparent up front is the easiest time to be transparent. You should never, you're going to end up on the front page of newspapers if you overpromise. If you overpromise and underdeliver. So do not be afraid to kind of draw that line in the sand and say, I cannot commit to this timeline because there are too many unknowns. You have not presented me with like your North Star for this project. We haven't agreed on like a minimum viable product. So I just can't give you a timeline. And I think that starts the relationship off right.
Yeah, getting those expectations set up front early and often, I think is good advice in the government and higher education sector, and probably good advice for any web project, but especially critical with this scale and complexity. Well, Malik, Kotob, Seth, Hill, thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you on the internet.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. Thank you, Steve.
Bye.